When you go to buy a house or take out some other type of loan, you have to meet some basic criteria. For example, you have to have a certain credit score and a certain earnings, and then you go to a bank and the bank creates money out of thin air and gives it to you. And then you're stuck paying off interest on that loan for years, and usually 30 years for a mortgage. Have you ever wondered why you aren't allowed to create that money out of thin air? I mean, that's all the bank does. They don't have the money themselves. They're creating money out of thin air to give to you, and then you have to pay off the interest. Well, as long as you meet the minimum criteria, how come an individual can't create money out of thin air? The reason you can't is because the system was set up that way. People aren't allowed to create money out of thin air. Only banking interests are allowed to. So only a small percentage of society which owns banks and is involved in banking is able to counterfeit money, in effect. And therefore the rest of us are pretty much going to be enslaved to them forever, because nobody else can really maintain the value of their wealth, because there's some people who are allowed to counterfeit money, a bank. And this system basically replaced feudalism in Europe. It was one system of slavery replacing another, and then it spread to America. And now our society is basically enslaved by it. Even if you rent, for example, you're still paying a huge percentage of your rent to your landlord, so your landlord can pay off the interest on the loan, the interest on the money that the bank has created out of nothing. There's absolutely no reason an individual shouldn't be able to create his own money out of thin air, as long as we give that same right to the bank. Now, in reality, I don't think anyone should be allowed to counterfeit money. The problem is that everyone in general society has been conditioned into believing that you have to throw extra money into the economy every year, otherwise you won't have real growth. They're confusing an increase in the paper money supply with true increase in value. But still, why would you give a bank the right to create that money? Why wouldn't you give everyone the right to create money, and then you could stimulate the economy that way? Why shouldn't a businessman or a homeowner, as long as they have a minimum credit score and have a certain income, why shouldn't they be able to create their own money and pay the interest to themselves rather than paying the interest to the bank? Or another option, if you believe that we need an inflating currency supply, is for the federal government to create its own budget out of thin air every year rather than taxing us. In reality, that's probably what would be necessary in some form as we transition back to sound money, because at this point the federal government has had to run up such a huge deficit that it's impossible for us to immediately transition back to sound money. But all of these are possibilities, rather than simply allowing the banking industry to be the only ones who can counterfeit money. The whole system is absurd, and the problem is that nobody ever really stops and thinks about just how absurd it is. So here's the challenge. Try to go out and explain to a regular person how the system works and why we desperately need to get rid of it. Better yet, explain it to one of your economics professors, because truths like sound money are hard to argue against. People can come up with diversionary arguments like you need an inflating currency supply to stimulate the economy. But as long as you keep bringing them back to the central argument that one entity, a bank, should not be allowed to exclusively counterfeit money, it's very hard for someone to argue against you and succeed. And it's also necessary to kind of keep a humble attitude when you're trying to prove this to other people, because nobody likes to overcome a lifetime of conditioning all at once, and no one likes to admit that they're basically a modern-day serf. But by sharing this information with other people, you help to reinforce it in your own mind, and you also help to hasten the day when this parasitic system is finally reformed, because people are waking up to it, and every parasitic system eventually collapses